Juz 29 starts with Mulk, which in its opening passages describes life as a test, then challenges man to look for faults, if any, in creation, before speaking of a conversation between the inhabitants of hell and its guards. 13 to 17 forces man to look beyond the apparent stability of the earth and the calm sky, then inviting him to look at the flight of the birds. 15 to 19. Yet the heedless man fails to respond and continues to ask about the time of the day of judgment. 25 to 27. Finally, the surah concludes warning them with water. If all your water were to be taken away, who would give you clear flowing water? Verse 30. Qalam starts with speaking of the truthfulness of the Prophet. It then refers to the offers of compromise that the disbeliever made to the Prophet, the story of the people of Garden, description of the day of judgment, how Allah gives time to allow the disbeliever to come to the truth, then ending with an invitation to patience in adversity. Haqqa starts with describing the punishment that came upon past communities, verse 4 to 12, before speaking of the trumpet, the 8 angels that will carry the throne of Allah, the book of record, the bliss of the believer, and the sad end of the disbeliever, verse 13 to 39. The final passage, 40 to 52, reiterates the truth of the messenger and his message. Indeed, the Quran is an absolute truth. Ma'arij starts with speaking of the length of Judgment Day to be 50,000 years, verse 6 to 7. 8 to 14 describes the terror of that day. 19 to 35 talks about man's response to good and evil in terms of faith and also provides a picture of the believers. 36 to 37 criticizes the disbelievers' attitude towards the messenger and the Quran, the surah concluding at 44, addressing the Prophet to leave them to face their fate on that promised day. Nuh starts with describing the mission of Nuh alayhi salam, his encounter with his people, the promise of reward, warning of punishment, followed by his complaint against them in verse 21, and then his dua against them in verse 24, ending with his humble appeal to Allah, verse 28, seeking forgiveness for himself, his parents, and all believers. Jinn from verse 1 to 19 is an account of what the jinn said about the Quran. 20 to 28 is asking the Prophet to deliver his message and the divine protection granted to him in the process. Muzammil is an instruction to the Prophet to stand up in worship, particularly at night, and recite the Quran with tartil. Muddathir instructs him to invite people to faith with advice and warning. It mentions the 19 angels as keepers of hell, followed by the disbelievers' confession on the day in verses 38 to 48. The surah ends making a firm statement about the Quran being a reminder. Qiyamah speaks primarily about the truth of resurrection and death from start to finish. 4 verses interrupt the sequence, 16 to 19, stating that Allah takes all responsibility for the Quran, its revelation, preservation, collection, and explanation. As the surah draws to an end, it states the truth about man's existence, how he was brought to being from a single drop. 36 to 40. Insan in 30 verses is a calm address encouraging people to turn to Allah. By contrast, Mursalat is more about warnings, with a host of images about the end of this world, the fates suffered by earlier communities, reminder of the origins of man, the rebuke of the disbeliever, and his stubborn rejection.
من أجبت دعاء نوح فانتصر وحملته في فلكك المشحون يا من أحال النار حول خليله روحا وريحانا